Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode of The Ghost Furnace. I am Bond. I am here with my cohort Nick Pennsylvania. How you doing, Nick?
Doing really good this week.
Excellent, man. And we are also joined by a returning guest, friend, fellow Fortean enthusiast, Brian from Thunderbird Ranch.
And if you don't pick up that reference, go back to episode 8 because Brian shared with us quite a story. Evening, Brian.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Bond. Yes, I am from Thunderbird Ranch here, where the illustrious episode 8 origin story was actually born. So it's great to have you back. It's been, I don't know, I think almost a year since I've been on this podcast. I can't believe it's been that long, but I did look back, and that's when it was.
Jeez. Yeah.
Yeah, that's our fault. We've been threatening to have you back for a while, though. So,
yeah, we've had a few topics that we've talked about and been like, I really want to know what Brian thinks about this. Finally, after our last episode, last week we had author W.T. Watson on to speak about his book for the Forest Poltergeist. And which was a great episode. We had a lot of fun talking to Travis as always. So please go back and listen to that episode. If you haven't picked up any of his books yet, this is a great one to start with. Can't recommend his work enough. And while going through it on more than one occasion, me and Nick were like, wonder what Brian's going to think about this. So I'm glad everything lined up and we were able to have you come back for this episode, Brian.
Thank you, Bond. I think for me, it was when you asked me to join this episode. At first, I thought I'm going to make sure I listen to the episode very thoroughly because oftentimes I'm pretty busy and I'm not keeping up with the episodes as much as I should. And when I listened to him, gosh, I better have my A game on because this is an individual who's done an extensive amount of research in the paranormal, in Bigfoot, in a variety of things, and he's very well read. And I certainly want to make sure I have somewhat of an intelligent response and analysis to what he said, because it was just so informative. It was chock full of things. You could have probably had 2-3 hours worth of discussion on this topic alone.
Yeah,
he's
easily.
such an interesting individual.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you're right. And again, not to just like toot Travis's horn, but he has such a way, I think, of conveying some really complex thoughts and does a really good job of pulling things apart down to like their base elements and explaining why questioning them is so important to the paranormal in general, because the things that we were talking about last week with the Forest Poltergeist, as we mentioned, have a value as intellectual experiments to lots of other things in lots of different disciplines. And that's why we knew that, because of your multidisciplinary background, we thought you'd have some good context to add to the conversation.
I think I was really struck. It wasn't so much the Bigfoot theme for me. That was certainly the predicate to what he was discussing. And that's one of the areas that he is trying to explain, I think, in part, is what creates these experiences for people where or something, where there's a disturbance. And so many of our documentaries that are on Travel Channel and the like have that general theme. There's somebody going out to the woods. They're apparently there for all the good reasons, recreation, so forth, not necessarily Bigfoot hunting, and they get more than they bargain for. It seems to be a general stereotype, a general theme.
Right.
Now, there are other programs that's very popular now, which they try to poke the bear, so to speak, and they are actively hunting this being or entity or whatever you might have. I took, I know in one of my I think it was actually the prior episode I was on, if I recall, I'm trying the name of the episode escapes me. It's been over a year, but we talked about poltergeists, and that was exactly the topic that we were engaged in. So when I heard
Right.
Travis talk about it in terms of poltergeists, that got me thinking really away from Bigfoot the entity into more of what are these people really experiencing in the woods? Why do people experience things in the woods? What does all that mean? It means more than just whether it's Bigfoot or some other type of entity. What does it mean about the person in the woods? And I'm not sure if you had sufficient time really to ask Travis that question or not, but that was kind of my question when I listened to his work.
Yeah, and the closest thing I can get to that would be, he had the analogy of the person that loved the woods and whatnot, but obviously that admittedly is an analogy that he created out of whole cloth. But yeah, this is like the classic when one starts getting into Carl Jung and stuff. It's often said it's not so much that you dreamt about a car driving along a street. It's about why that car, why that street, sort of thing. What does it say about the people that are going into the woods and such?
Right. That was something that he said, or one of you said over and over again. It can be in the woods and it can be brought inside. That was something that continued to be mentioned
Right.
in the conversation. So that kind of leads me to my overall view of poltergeists, and
Okay.
I think since I've been a guest on this particular program for so many times, I've become much more skeptical about paranormal. And that's I don't know why, but I think it's because we've taken a lot more time to investigate folklore, investigate myth and legend, really dig into very specific aspects of why do these odd things happen in our world. The other part of it is the multidisciplinary part that I bring into it, and that is psychology. And I've mentioned that before, that by my own training, geared around seeing an individual psychology in terms of their past. And what I mean is, we bring our past into the present all the time, good or bad or ugly or neutral. It happens. So that's really the bent I come from. I'm trained formally in psychology, and I'm actually a trauma therapist. I'm certified and boarded in trauma interventions and services. It's something I've done a long time, and it's certainly something I work with on a daily basis. And what I notice about people is whenever they come into the room, they're bringing their past. They're triggered, often triggered by things, sometimes that we don't even know why they're triggered, but they're triggered by something. And I also take kind of a perspective of our memories form packages of things. And I think I used it in my notes that I sent to you, the neural network perspective. And that is where our memories of one encompasses the emotional. It's called encoding, basically, is what it's called. And it can be sounds, it can be sensory. And it's amazing how certain things with people can become coded together. You wouldn't even really imagine why they would, but sometimes people have adverse experiences and then experiences in their present moment, wherever they are, whether they're inside or outside of a house or a building or a room, react to these things. So when I listen to Travis and what he's talking about, the thing I like about it is he's being very reasonable about this situation and not getting into the exaggerated aspects of Bigfoot or the Bigfoot phenomena. He is actually looking at it from a standpoint of can be many things to explain why they're happening, and he didn't really conclude too much. He gave a lot of suggestions and hypotheses as to why they would, but that's certainly where I'm coming from, is that those individuals that have these experiences, why do they happen? Why do any of us have any experiences with their environment? I mean, I've come on this program with several experiences regarding paranormal phenomena, but why?
Very, very well said. And I think that he and last week we, really like the crux we were getting at with a lot of these things was there's a myriad of possible sources that can show up in various different ways depending on where they are. The environment does play a part in it, but like you're saying, there is a large emotional component to a lot of these. You use the term was it coding or coded when it comes to comes to these things. Can you speak a little bit more about how that works from a psychological standpoint? Because that's not a term that I'm particularly familiar with and would like to know more about.
So when things happen to us in our environment, right from the point that we're actually born and all the way up through to adulthood and even beyond our young adulthood, right now you are encoding memories. We are on this meeting that we're having. We're putting together this podcast. We've been interacting now for about 15 or 20 minutes, both, off recording and on recording. And we're forming experiences. And not only are we forming a memory around the content or the cognitive pieces of what we're talking about, but we're forming probably when you're out in an environment talking to somebody, you're forming some type of sensory experience, meaning what were the sights, smells, what was the sound of the person's voice, what did they say, how did that make me feel, what were the things that happened, right down to touch, the five senses, smell, touch, taste, etc., etc. Those things and visual, especially visual things, more so than verbal things, can become encoded. And that's encoded, encoded. So a memory can be encoded. Something happens to me. For example, I have a near accident by falling off a ladder. So then I've encoded that experience. And then when I'm presented with a possibility of going on a ride or on a plane or something that involves height, that will trigger me, because what it's doing is it's going down the neural network. It's triggering some memory within that network, and it is creating a experience for me, good or bad. In this case, it'd be bad. So each time we do something, we're encoding something. This will be encoded. This meeting that we're having. So that's generally what I'm speaking to, and memories are very vast. I mean, you could have 5 or 6 different memories that are connected together that create an experience.
And Brian, this touches upon two things I know I talk a lot about, not just here, but if you run into me at the supermarket, and that is phenomenological psychology, that our experiences essentially create our reality, but also the linguistic concept of subtext, where so much of our experience and interaction in our lives is influenced by subtext. And the example I always go to is the one that was first presented to me. You're in an empty parking garage in the early hour, 2, 3 in the morning, and you hear a sound. Like, well, what's just your general feeling being in the empty parking garage? I've got a fruit cellar in my house I've never stepped foot in. If I found myself waking up there randomly, what would and there's no reason for me to have those feelings because I haven't had any of those memories outside of my engagement with media. But then there's the phenomenological, which is the different thing, where it is those firsthand, it is those actual things which occur, which form our reality. I'm curious in the psychological discourse if the memories that you're talking about and how they influence our behavior moving forward, such as, I know something you've talked about is maybe a cultural fear of the woods and whatnot. Is there any conversation about we might have had experiences that others have documented that maybe that person doesn't remember? They happened so young. We know such things like attachment disorders can begin with very, very young children. I'm kind of curious as to if people could be influenced by things that occurred to them that they themselves don't necessarily remember. And I'm not talking about, say, repressed memories. I hope that's not a really scattered way of asking a question, but basically, what influence do events have, even if we can't remember them? I don't know if there's any conversation on that.
Yeah, I think certainly there is reason to believe that, imprinting, and that's really what you're talking about with early experiences with babies. And, there's a whole bunch of research that any of us have ever taken developmental psychology. We talk about imprinting. And Conrad Lorenz was a famous uh, psychologist, really more of a scientist who was able to imprint certain kinds of things in the early experiences of ducks. He made them follow him because he was seen as the parent to those ducks. When you're looking at attachment disorders, you're looking at very early things, meaning attunement is the word that I would use psychologically, meaning if the mother or the father is attuned to that child's certain imprinting and certain types of memory forming and early experiences, meaning is it dangerous or is it not dangerous, forms to some degree. And one of the things that I mentioned in my notes here, as I was preparing for this episode, was the fact that I did to think about the woods as being maybe scary places, that they're very mysterious places. I remember when I was a kid, very young, I don't know where I heard it, but I heard it somewhere. Somebody said, well, the boogeyman's going to come out and get you. What is the boogeyman? I mean, what is that? And, it made me scared to really go out in the dark. It made me scared to not go someplace to the car without my parents. And this is kind of that cultural scripting that goes on. I mean, there is actually people that, I mean, I had to look it up, but, there's people that develop sensitivities around cultural fear of the woods, xylophobia. I never heard of it. There's all kinds of phobias, but I don't know if too many people are afraid of the woods, but is their life and their memories? I know, getting back to the topic of just looking at the poltergeist situation, I've always been of the opinion that poltergeists are just functions of our own weather, the weather we bring to a situation. And it could be based upon encoding, imprinting, early adverse experiences. It could bring, bad situations that have occurred, adverse situations that have occurred for a person. And then, and I think what struck me was that Travis said, well, it can be in the woods or it can be brought inside. So it really doesn't matter where you are. So I would begin to wonder, aside from some of these other explanations, what is the impact of paranormal on, or what do people bring into the paranormal situation? Do they bring something emotionally that triggers, okay, that's what I was taught, so that's what I'm going to see?
Yeah, I think that with the encoding with what you're asking right there, there has to be at least some kind of correlation, you'd think. If somebody reads dozens of books on a topic and watches thousands of hours of TV on a topic, they are certainly going to have at some point, as you said, kind of encoded those experiences into something that is, running in the background. Nick uses the term primed a lot when we're talking about these places. And I think that's an interesting correlation you're drawing, Brian, about like us bringing it, because we talk about like where this stuff comes from. And again, it probably comes from it's probably not as simple as one source, obviously. It's probably a mix of things depending on different environments or situations. But
Interconnected memories, as Brian talked about, it's not
right,
singular
right.
points.
And one of the things that I've talked about a few times on this show is it's a dumb, not dumb, shouldn't say that. People joke with philosophy where it's like, oh, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. I think that it's also just as relevant to ask if you have a haunted house in the woods and there's no one there to experience the haunting, is it in fact haunted at that point? Are apparitions just walking around with no one to observe them? Like, what is the role that the person has
Yeah.
in these experiences? And and I know that doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover like the flesh and blood Bigfoot explanations and things like that. But I think what you're talking about, Brian, as far as us bringing the historical and cultural and personal, I don't say baggage, but just like that information and data to an experience has to affect it in some way, shape, or form.
Well, it comes back to what Brian asked, what you asked earlier, which was, what about these people that are going in the woods? If that makes sense. And I think we touched upon it in the conversation. I brought up so much of poltergeist activity I remember reading a lot was about, especially like teenagers, when they're just everything's very ramped up and everything. If you introduce trauma into that, I think there's a lot to be said for it. And going back to the weather that we bring, which is again a turn of phrase that you introduced us some time ago that is hard to let go, because it's just when you say it, it's one of those things that makes you consider things. But yeah, just coming back to it, we're bringing so much out there with us. I don't know where you want to go with that.
Well, I want to just, I'll come to that in a minute, but there was something that Bond had just said a moment ago about, the memories and what people bring into things based upon their memories. We know that through generations, each time a generation is produced by the previous generation, we know that we know that trauma can actually be transferred through DNA. That is a wild, wild assumption. And I recently learned that because I've been involved in some very extensive training recently on neural networks, and I can talk a little more about that outside of the show. But what I learned, and I had to just kind of like breathe for a moment. I thought,
Right.
really? Wow, that's really amazing. Meaning something that my grandfather or grandmother had experienced is still within me. So how does that, and it does make sense a little bit because my grandmother was very afraid of heights. Okay. Not only did she make me afraid of heights, I probably inherited that from her.
Well, I think about what we've learned about adverse childhood experiences, and the more adverse childhood experiences you have, and the more like they can be as strong an indicator of like cardio issues as much as some other deliberate lifestyle things that we make. That's a very real, tangible, physical change in one's body because of experiences we've had that might not be visibly scarring, but they definitely have tangible. So for me, it's not a huge difference to say like those neuro building blocks. I'm butchering the language, but those neural connections could be altered generationally as well. So I don't know if I'm totally believing it, but I definitely see how it could be. So it doesn't seem that far a drive for me.
I think there is a lot in our storytelling and in our culture that like supports that. And I think when people use the word generational trauma, like you're saying right now, that like it's physically passed down, I think that that kind of sends off alarm bells for certain people that sounds
Fatalistic almost, like it's
yeah,
predetermined.
yeah, that's a yes, thank you. That's a better way of saying what I was trying to get to. Like, I don't think that's what you're saying, Brian. I think what you're saying is that like the things that may help determine how we interpret a situation in our environment has such a complex set of origins that we are still only now being able to, theorize and kind of unpack. For as long as people have been doing psychology, this is a new concept, but it's something that in theory has been with us for time in memoriam.
Yeah, and I want to get back to, I want to go to the second area that I kind of detoured from here just a moment ago, and that is motivated perception. I sent both of you a little definition of that, and I thought, wow, this actually might have some explanation too as to why people have the experiences that they do, and it's really something that's been researched in psychology a long time. It's basically our bias, and the world as we conceive it in our awareness is not exactly an accurate representation of what it truly is. So that makes a lot of sense because when you look at a lot of the, and I'm not trying to in any way disparage any of the legitimate, very serious researchers, Bigfoot researchers, paranormal researchers. I don't dispute that they are sensing something. They are finding something. They're not sure what it is, but they
Yeah.
are there's something out there. And we know that. But I think sometimes there is this intentional bias going into these kinds of areas, whether they be woods or other natural areas, and we're almost geared like we're expecting we're going to see something. So, if I'm going to an area that is known or renowned for being very significant Bigfoot or other paranormal experience, and then I see a rock or something, if I see a noise, okay, I'm going to interpret that as Bigfoot. Now I know what Travis was talking about was very, class B. He was talking about class B types of phenomena. These are things that are actually, things are being thrown, things are being, something's, something's happening. There's sounds, there's roars, there's
Without an obvious
whatnot.
source.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So is it possible that not only are we selectively geared towards seeing those kinds of things, and maybe also in our neurology or our DNA, we have certain types of encoding or so forth that's happened, but are we not also, just vulnerable or more open to those things? I've always believed that there's a lot of bright people out there, and we don't understand. That's the thing. The thing I
Right.
really liked about Travis's statements was that he did not necessarily conclude, or he was not dogmatic, I don't think, about, okay, this is what it is, or this is what it could. He just goes where the evidence takes him. And I love that type of exploration. He seemed probably the most interesting and enlightening way of looking at this topic that I've heard of for a long time. He wasn't ruling anything out. Probably a mix of, okay, our DNA is kind of set up for this. We have and it all kind of comes together a perfect storm, and we're experiencing something.
Yeah, he's in fact the way I interpreted it, he's almost you say he's not ruling anything out. He's almost widening the door because if I had to boil down a lot of the book to a single idea, it would be that, hey, we're hearing these things and we're attributing this, but until we have conclusive evidence that that is exactly what it is, why are you so quick to say that? And that's where I think people have become dogmatic. And I know a lot of our conversation that we had was about if you took these same experiences and you put them in a different setting, you would attribute it to this thing. Well, sure, it made sense to me. And again, it very much, if you're going to instantly attribute something because you're in a place, as you bring up, Brian, that other people have claimed to have had experiences with specific thing, you're going to attribute it to that. You're not going where the evidence leads. And I think that's a big thing, is this thing did happen. And he always says, and we've always,
Mm-hmm.
to a person, been very clear, like, we believe people when they say this happened. But to then accredit it to something that you did not see for sure, that you don't have the additional physical evidence for, I think is, again, doing the opposite of what you applaud Travis, going where evidence leads us.
Yeah, I think that I was listing in my mind all these other things that it could be, and I think I provided you somewhat of a list of things, everything from having a phobia to interdimensional collisions to tape theory to these were just notes that I made, or that Bigfoot is really good at Jedi mind tricks. And I don't mean any
Right.
disrespect there, but that's essentially what that
Yeah.
when you look at the documentaries, there's always a confusion or a haze or there's an alien involved. There's always some type of Jedi mind trick, so to speak, for those Starfield collisions and time travels and things that might, what's happening, what that person themselves is
Right.
experiencing as a class B phenomenon could in fact be something coming from another dimension in the future coming into their past. And who knows, I mean,
Right.
it's just there's more that we don't really know. But I have no doubt that we bring our own weather into this mix here, our own emotions, memories,
Right.
encoded learning, which is acting on this phenomenon.
Right. And I think that like that kind of gets to the point that I think we're all talking about here, is like this stuff is more complicated, and from you shouldn't taxonomize things that you don't need to. That leads to the kind of dogmatic principles that you had mentioned, Nick, and kind of makes things fall into these categories that you were just kind of outlining as examples there, Brian. And I think that getting to the psychological side of things with the poltergeist activity, I think, just again, this is me kind of speaking anecdotally without having the data in front of me, but it is often attributed to, like, kids in their adolescence. That's like the story arc we hear a lot with poltergeist activity. However, I think, and I've heard other folks say this too, that just as reasonable to think that it's not so much the age or the like physical makeup of the person, but the emotional makeup of the person. You introduce heightened experiences. You introduce liminality, like you mentioned, Brian, trauma, like just like big T heavy type things. You're more likely to have this, whether it's the random psychokinetic activity elements, whether it's the projecting apparitions, any of those kind of things. What do you think? What role, Brian, do you think trauma and those heightened experiences, those encoding, what can that do when we're either going into the woods or going anywhere really? How do you think those things actually impact our paranormal experiences?
And that's a very good question, Bond. I think that, and that's one that I've thought about long and hard. Trauma in and of itself is based upon adverse experiences which encode onto the brain a number of different sensory inputs. And people, if you went through one singular substantial event, meaning like a weather event or an accident or an assault, or you watch somebody die in front of you, something of that nature. That's a big T type trauma. That can make a person very vulnerable to things in their environment. And then you have those that I work a lot with, and that is more complex types of trauma, meaning they have had repeated incidences of adverse experiences and events. Now, what does that play? How does that play a part in a person going into, let's say, doing a paranormal investigation or
Right.
going into a wooded area? Woods in and of themselves do not really scare me. However, if you've had prior experiences in the dark, in the wood, I think that Nick mentioned the example of a parking garage. I'm scared to death of parking garages. I think you're very vulnerable because I had a couple experiences that were not very positive. I think that it opens that person up. And I think there's also, when you look at trauma, it is perceived fear. Those are the two words that go around it. So I am very quick to perceive something fearful when I have been traumatized. And I actually see it all over me, all over the place. Somebody that has been significantly traumatized will see fear everywhere. But yet, here's the irony of trauma is that people who have had those types of adverse experiences sometimes seek them out. And I don't say that to be disparaging. That is just part and parcel. They become more connected, more to see things that other people can't see, or experience things that, again, may be more selective and not really there, but they think that they're there. And, again, I go back to that episode I did about a year ago about the house and the person in the house that was living in that house. And the episode escapes me, but for those who are loyal listeners, they can probably scale back and find it. That person in that particular video was living in a house. There was all this paranormal stuff happening. It was like this perfect storm of things. And there was somebody in the backyard that was potentially buried. And there was a horrific event that happened. All of that stuff could have been still laying around. But that person, compared to another person, how would they have been? That person was extremely vulnerable. But interestingly, I think those people that sometimes, I want to make sure that is separately viewed compared to a
Right.
person who's just a plain sensitive, somebody who's just sensitive and who has some innate
Hmm.
abilities to pick up on things and see things that the average person cannot.
Like none of these things are going to explain all of the situations, like you mentioned, there's some people who are just, yeah, they're just simply more sensitive. We know some of those people, and that's very different than someone who, like you mentioned, has gone through all these wild events and are more likely to innately have a fearful response to some kind of stimulus or perceived threat in the environment around them. How does our comfort and how does our familiarity with a space, do you think, interact with that? Because the woods can be very different for some people. They can, like you said, some people are generally fearful of it. Some people feel very at home in the woods. But there's also people who probably, because of the things you mentioned, fear being in a certain place, dwelling, certain people fear, out being out on a road or in the streets or in a parking garage or in a, office building. So how does the environment play a part in how people basically are forming this encoding and reacting and how that's helping them come to an understanding about what their experience is? And how do you think that interacts with the paranormal?
That's a very, very good question. I can tell you the environment
Yeah,
plays a big part.
it
And,
seems like it does. Yeah, I don't know
you
what the
know,
answer is.
one of the people that I was trained by said to me, we are living in one of the most, although if you watch the news, you might not agree with what I'm saying, but I'm going to say this more as a generality compared to individuals that lived back in the days where you had this is like prehistoric times,
Right.
early times, when you were fearful that if you went outside you were going to potentially be attacked by an animal or something. His comment was, "We are living in one of the most secure times in human history." Not, I'm not relating to people probably send you letters and say, "No, we're not. We're, just watch CNN or watch Fox News and you'll know that we're not." But generally we are. And, but yet, our society is dangerous in certain areas. But we are living in one of
Right.
the most secure times generally. We have the creature comforts, we have all of the technology, we've got great health care options for people. There's a lot of opportunity for a lot of people, not
Yeah.
everybody, but there
Right.
certainly
Right.
is. So, in terms of that, there are still people walking around in the environment worried. Anxiety and depression is the highest disorders out there,
Hmm.
closely followed by post traumatic stress disorder. So, I think that have a general society that does have a proclivity towards having mood disorders, having early childhood experiences that are negative. Um, I think and this is going to be really hard for me to explain, but if you look at all that we know about paranormal, there's something going on out there. We don't know what it really is. And Travis,
Right.
couldn't really, coming back to the Travis
Yeah.
topic here, he knows there's something going on, but we don't really know what's going on. So the interplay that I see is that, people who have emotional, I'm not even going to say it's mental disorders, I'm going to say emotional sensitivities or mood changes, or they're much more vulnerable to things, they are going to be able to pick up on this stuff probably a lot quicker than the stoic guy. I pick up on things. I think there's just so many variables to that because there is something going on. There is so many books.
Yeah.
If you go on Amazon and you look at any of these authors up that do this stuff on Travel Channel or whatnot, they have 30 some books on these topics, and so there's such a plethora of that stuff out there. There's so much that's been written about paranormal and experiences, and I think that the people that are more open to it, more vulnerable. I'm one of them. I've, and I've had several episodes here where I've been pretty open ended with some of my experiences that I've
Yeah.
had. And do I know why I've had those experiences? I don't know, but I am a little more sensitive than the average.
Right. And I think what you kind of touched on there is something that we haven't like said, I think Bear is saying is this stuff isn't all bad, when it comes to this paranormal stuff and like our interactions with it. There are people that have, very consistently good and positive interactions with different paranormal elements. And I'm even going to throw like spiritual elements into that, like as far as the metaphysical goes. And you have people that, have these spiritual practices or they're meditative or put in whatever word you want there that kind of train themselves to be a little more sensitive in one way or another. And they have a lot of really great experiences and it enriches their life and they're able to, a lot of times help other people. So it's not like it's just negative emotions that lead to negative interactions in the woods and in houses and in parking garages. There is another side to that coin, and I think that's important to recognize as well. We're not just being all doom and gloom, uh, though we tend to dwell there sometimes. Um, but I think what you're saying is really interesting. Like to use like to use one of Travis's examples, if you're in the woods and you hear these class B encounter type things, are there ways where we can think about that in a healthier, more pragmatic, more psychological manner that might be beneficial for us?
It's interesting because it's almost ironic that there is so much literature on Bigfoot. That was the primary um,
Right.
paranormal example used in that particular discussion. There's so much to talk about Bigfoot, and people love to talk about it. And we love to, have conversations about it and go into environments that espouse those beliefs. But when it comes down to it, I've also seen interviews with people who have actually stated that they saw a Bigfoot beyond a class B. I don't know if that'd be class
Class
A
A,
or,
yeah.
it'd be a higher grade. Yeah. And they're scared to death. It's changed them forever. It's actually traumatized
Right.
them, and they look like
Mm-hmm.
traumatized individuals. So I think to some degree, we need to be a little bit more middle of the road. We need to examine, when we enter the field of working with people. One of the things that I was told long time ago was you need to know yourself a little bit before you go in and start getting into other people's lives and exploring their lives. You need to know where your vulnerabilities are. It's called countertransference. That's borrowing a term from Freud, the psychodynamic beliefs. And it's really good, before you go into those situations. And this is what I've kind of thought about. I've had people come up to me and say, Brian, you're really into this stuff. Wouldn't you want to go down to West Virginia, down to that, big prison down there? And I'm like, no,
Penitentiary,
not
yeah.
really,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I know myself. I know that, and I've been to Mansfield personally. I've been to Mansfield. I've done a tour there, and I never want to go back because of what I picked up. And we've never done that for a show here, but
Just
the
teasing
point
for a
is, I want to
future
answer
one
your
then.
question. Yes, I'm teasing. Yes, I was actually in Mansfield. I think you got to know yourself. I mean, before I went to Mansfield
Right.
prison, I saw the one doc is a couple of them, couple of ghost
Mm-hmm.
people groups that went there, and it's like, oh wow, I really want to do that. I really want to go and explore that. I want to investigate. I want to go down into the hole and see if they really experience the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I did that, and maybe for a future episode we can talk about that
Yeah.
experience. But I will tell you, I never want to go back again. Why? Because I was not prepared. And I think that that's where the psychology part comes in. People that go into these experiences don't know themselves well enough.
Right.
Not all of them. Some of them are
Mm-hmm.
very prepared, to
For
do
sure.
that. And maybe they're not even looking for Bigfoot, but they or Ohio, Southern Ohio, or wherever, Northern California, and they're like just carrying on their day, and they have rocks being thrown at them, or disruption, or something that just scares them to death. I think you got to know yourself. I think that's the whole idea, whether it's going inside a house and exploring that house, or even if you're living in an environment that you think something could be going on, or in an environment, wild environment, you really need to know what you're doing, because quite frankly, you could take something back with you, or it could affect you in ways you never thought possible.
So what you're saying is like don't poke the bear sometimes. Like if you're not ready to poke the bear, don't poke the bear. I think that's really good advice with a lot of these things. And like if you're someone who is, not great with big open spaces, being quiet, things like that, maybe going into the woods and sitting on a stump for an hour or two might actually be a really stress inducing situation. For some people, that's probably sounds really nice. Other people, not so much. And you're right, you have to kind of know yourself and be putting yourself in situations where even if it's stereotypically or commonly seen as being a mundane situation, it might not be. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people going into houses that are reportedly haunted or whatever and sitting down and asking if there's anything weird there out loud to seemingly nothing. Both of those are kind of poking a bear in some cases. Not saying either of those is necessarily bad, but it can be a weird situation for people to find themselves in if they're not really comfortable with who they are and what they're doing.
Well, and I think even just enough self-reflection to realize, am I looking too hard to confirm something that I want to be there maybe? I
Right.
I'm reminded of watching one of these. It was a Canadian television show, and I wish I could. I think it was Paranormal Home Inspector. It's been some years, but they would have a psychic come in, and then they would have just a regular home inspector. And like I said before, he should be a folk hero. Okay, there should be songs written about the man. But there was one particular thing. There was some interesting things that came from the show, but there was one thing that really frustrated me, and that was the homeowner was so convinced there had to be something paranormal, but the home inspector was very concerned because the hot water heater was giving off high levels of carbon monoxide. And
Oh
he
wow.
said, right. And he said, this might be the real reason why you're getting tired in here and you're reporting seeing things. Like, these are dangerous levels. And the person, I was so frustrated because they said, well, yeah, we should get that checked out for sure, but I really do believe it's this thing. Well, maybe if you're really believing in that, okay, but you need to take care of this for safety reason, but also you need to be able to rule the carbon monoxide out as a thing. And so it's not just
Yeah.
about, I know I'm going somewhere a little different than what Brian's saying. And Brian, I believe you're saying, you need to be fundamentally stable, understanding who you are, because when you're doing into things like there, you will be psychologically impacted. I know in your line of work, there's a lot of conversation about the trauma that you experience through other people and exploring them. I think though, what I'm saying is also you need to be self-reflective, and sometimes we need to check ourselves. Am I looking too hard to confirm something I'm wanting to believe? Am I following the evidence in the way, again, that Brian and all of us to a person applaud Travis Watson for doing?
No, what's the phrase that like a man with a hammer only sees nails? Something like
Right, to
that.
the man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Problem. Yeah, and I think that's like where the knowing yourself with the not just with paranormal stuff, but just in general, it's so important when trying to figure out where stuff comes from and the possible causes of certain things and our biases. It gets really complicated and can be really complex, and that's okay. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't do us or any of the causes any justice by ignoring them.
Well, in some things, I think these things are really hard. They can seem obvious in retrospect, but they're very hard to. I know, kind of working. I'm not in Brian's field, but I'm in a peripheral thing. And I know sometimes people will struggle at certain times of the year, not realizing that they're approaching an anniversary of a significant trauma or loss in their life. And how do you prepare yourself for that if you haven't connected those dots yet? And I think that's maybe where having other people, your friends, your connections, they're the scaffolding around you. I feel like the more I talk, the more further away from the point I'm getting. But I think you're both following me.
Yeah, I think that the idea of trauma, our brains, and how they work is only one. I want to say that to the listeners is that don't take what I'm saying as being the only thing that could
Right.
lead to a person's experience for paranormal. And also, I want to make sure everybody knows that I am not in disagreement with paranormal phenomena at all. I just don't know where it all fits yet. I know
Right.
it fits, and I think that's what I was trying to discuss today in terms of Travis's numerous examples that he gave about different things happening and why, what the different things he's uncovered. Well, there's something there to that. I've always felt that. And if anybody has any doubt about my beliefs, they certainly should listen to some of my other episodes on this podcast because I go into some other non psychological realms here.
Right.
It's just that I'm much more, I think I've learned so much more about how people's psychology can within the environment and can create further exposure or further experiences that could exacerbate their experiences with paranormal.
No, I think the idea of exacerbating things is really accurate because I know that with paranormal stuff, when you start attributing causes and building kind of that narrative, like Travis mentioned, and you're not aware of some of these cognitive biases or some of this, neural network encoding that you're talking about, Brian, things start to kind of build and seem like they're becoming more and more credible. But if that initial premise is still just like a assumption based off of two things that we can't really understand or know, then like how good is is that house of cards? And
To the
should you be
person
making
to the person who has the rock thrown at them, everything is a Bigfoot.
You
Oh,
know,
you said something about
different kinds
dimensional
of.
clashing? I remember I wrote it down. You said something to
Yeah,
that.
right.
Not a term. I think I understand what you're saying with that, but I don't know. Could you go into that a little bit, just because I am curious of as how you're defining that?
Well, it's probably not the right word for it, but recently I've become familiar, particularly with UFO thinking, UFO research. There is a current thought process now that what we're seeing could be aliens or extraterrestrial beings coming from the future into the past to check up on how we're doing. And there could be things, there's been a lot of talk about Bigfoot cloaking or invisibility, that he's here and or she or he or them is here and then not here. And why are they not here? We see them sort of in the shadows and then they're gone. There's been so many examples. I mean, there was one up in Erie, Pennsylvania, many years ago, decades ago, where there was a sighting of UFOs, and then there was also a Bigfoot connection that was a part of that. The whole idea is that there could be different dimensions or different time related. I think it's probably a time machine. It was actually this time machine documentary I was watching recently, and it just blew my mind in the sense that it was saying that we could actually be kind of living in a mingled kind of environment with those other people. And some of the examples that they gave was these pictures, and here we go with selective attention again, pictures of what looks like a Victorian lady holding a cell phone, for example,
I
which it may
remember that
not have
got
been. It
very
was something
popular.
else. Yes,
Yeah,
it
I
was
remember
very,
when that came out.
Steve
It caused quite a
Jobs'
stir.
phone was there. Yes. But there's also a lot of thinking about how is time travel possible. And I think that's just one of the theories that are out there, is that there could be things going on in our environment that we can't explain that could relate to other things or entities or people from another area that we don't even
right?
know where they're coming from. And you probably need to get a physicist on the air here to give some more description, because that is beyond my wheelhouse. But that is something that I think is possible. Is there a possibility that some of the experiences we're having have nothing, the knocks in the night, so to speak, or have nothing to do with a paranormal? It is paranormal, but something that is physically happening somewhere else. And the stone tape theory has talked about how it records things from the past, and you look at repetitive kinds of hauntings and things like that. Is that a part of it? We don't really know. It's just things are kind of mixed up in a jumble here.
Right. And I think that like what you're talking about is an example of why we should stay open and not silo ourselves and not get caught up in, the dogma and kind of building these, well, if this then this kind of structures, because we don't know what the answers are. We don't know what's causing these things, and some of those things are by nature probably even unknowable in some cases.
As
Um,
Travis said, none of us are experts. There
right.
can be no expert until we have more physical things.
Right, exactly. And like, so I think a lot of people, when they hear about like time traveling Bigfoot or they hear about interdimensional aliens, they kind of roll their eyes. And it's like, yeah, like I understand why you're rolling your eyes, but why is that any less valid to talk about than some of these other things? Because we're just, throwing darts in the dark right now for a lot of these things. And like you mentioned, Brian, as far as like us finding out new things about like, science from a scientific standpoint, which is on people act like science is on the opposite end of, spirituality or metaphysics, but it really doesn't necessarily have to be that way. We can talk about all of it because we're conjecturing about these things. We don't need to build epistemological structures off of nothing. So I think the idea of questioning, staying open, and having honest conversations that involve both our collective narratives about these things are important, but also, like you said, knowing yourself and knowing what we bring to the table, what weather we bring with us, as you eloquently say. It's important to keep all of that in the realm of what we're aware of when discussing all of these things. That's what's going to move us forward collectively over time, even if we're not all doing it at once together.
Yeah, I think that's what I really, really like about what Travis did in his discussion, in his works that he does. He does not try to, he's not dogmatic
Right.
about anything. He is a true investigator who doesn't really call, I don't know if he calls himself an investigator, but he seemed, there's so much humility around what he's doing. I looked him up. Oh my, he's really written a lot of things here, and that's very impressive. However, you wouldn't really know it because he just continues to explore one thing after another and says, "Well, it's over. This is over here on this shelf, and this is over here on this shelf." Okay, I've always believed that a thing called the dialectic, and this is where I'll end my discussion on psychology tonight. The dialectic means that there can be two opposites that can be true. Okay. There's a thing that we do in one of the therapeutic approaches that we use to work with people is called dialectic behavior therapy. And I'm not going to bore people with the details, but the whole idea is, bad and good can both be happening. It's not either or. And I think it's a really good example when we look at paranormal work is that there can be this over here and there can be this over here and there can be this over here. It doesn't mean maybe one sounds a little bit bizarre more than the other.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think that's a really nice philosophical way of understanding it.
Well, if you have out there a different philosophical way we should be understanding all of this or have something to add to the conversation, we'd love to hear about it. So if you want, you can get a hold of us at the Ghost Furnace Podcast, either on Instagram or Facebook or YouTube, or you can simply just send us an email at theghostfurnacepodcast@gmail.com.